Good morning and afternoon, everyone. My name is Aaron Gorell, and thank you for participating in our 1208th Justice Clearinghouse webinar, Wellness as a Survival Mechanism. Stress management provided us with the tools we needed when we were already stressed, but didn't help us from becoming stressed. Well, we now recognize that stress and trauma can occur in any aspect of our lives, and our best preparation for these challenges is met in the concept of wellness. And so during our webinar today, Dwayne Bowers is with us to show how, in the face of personal, local, national, and global trauma and challenge, the wellness model of taking care of ourselves helps us prepare to cope with the crises and chaos we face in these times. Dwayne will also talk about how to create a personal wellness plan. Dwayne Bowers is a licensed professional counselor and educator in private practice. As a therapist, Dwayne's specialty is working with survivors of trauma and traumatic loss, child exploitation and trafficking, which includes providing support to families of abducted, missing, exploited, trafficked, and murdered victims, as well as professional staff working directly in the field. Dwayne is responsible for the development of, support, clinical supervision, and training of staff and volunteers for a variety of organizations, including Project Safeguard, which provides support to the staff of the National Center for Missing and Exploited Children. I did want to let everyone know that today's presentation is being done in partnership with the National Organization for Victim Assistance. We certainly love partnering with organizations like the NOVA, who are so committed to enhancing and growing our profession. Now, briefly, before we begin, I'd like to share with you some information about Justice Clearinghouse. The Justice Clearinghouse is the only peer-to-peer multidisciplinary educational program for justice professionals that offers the instruction and skills necessary to achieve both individual and organizational transformation. Through a year-round virtual conference, our audience and members develop those crucial skills that are necessary to positively impact themselves and their communities. And while anyone can attend our live events, our paid members are able to access this content on their own schedule with over 1,200 hours of recorded sessions, and are also eligible to receive certificates of attendance that may be used when seeking continuing education credits. So if you're not presently a member, I would invite you to join today and support our work. Now, the last couple of things I'd like to address with everyone is some basic housekeeping items. First, this event is being recorded and the formal presentation is scheduled to last about 60 minutes. It will be available to members on the Justice Clearinghouse website. Second, this is a listen-only tool, but you can type in any questions you have through the GoToWebinar toolbar, and we'll take as many of those questions as possible at the end of the formal presentation. Now, we do have several polling questions incorporated into this webinar, and I'd like to ask the first question, which is, what is the key reason why you attend webinars? And while you're considering your responses, I did want to point out that in the handout section of the toolbar, you'll find a daily wellness plan template that you can use to design that for yourself. All right, I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll. I'll share the results here. All right, 61% of you indicated ongoing access to training. 21% said continuing education credits. And by the way, I wanted to let you know that we have a special program coming up this summer called our Summer School of Training, starting in June and going through August, where anyone, whether you're a member or not, can download your attendance certificate. And then 12% inspiration, 4% convenience, and 2% other. Thank you all so much for that. Finally, after today's presentation, there will be a follow-up survey, and we ask that you complete it. Your feedback is shared with our presenters and helps us shape everything we do here at Justice Clearinghouse. With that, I'll go ahead and turn the presentation over to our instructor for this morning. Dwayne, it's all yours.
Thank you, Aaron, and welcome everybody. I am Dwayne Bowers, and we're here to talk about wellness as a survival mechanism. And just to give you a little background on how this kind of evolved, actually, it was a discussion between Christine, Aaron, and I about how hard it is to get an appointment with a mental health person. And we were talking about the fact that ever since the pandemic, it's been harder and harder to schedule an appointment with a mental health person. And the reason for that is we as mental health folks are just overwhelmed at this point with folks needing support. And the number one diagnosis that most people have when we are working with people is anxiety. And what we hear people saying all the time are, so how are you doing? And we'll hear things like, well, I'm getting by. or I don't know, I just seem to be moving from crisis to crisis, or I just seem to be on a survival mode. And so out of that discussion, it seemed to be a good idea to talk about why are we in this situation now where our anxiety is so much higher, and where so many people are looking to find some support from mental health. And if you'll notice, one of the things that evolved out of the pandemic was this idea of not only mental health, but also there's more and more applications and more texting and more email types of mental health too, simply because there just aren't enough mental health folks to handle the load at this point. And so this is where the idea came from as far as looking at wellness as a survival mechanism. So let's start by just looking at what are we going to call wellness? How are we going to define wellness? And I used a variety of different sources for that. The first definition I found from the Global Wellness Institute was the active pursuit of activities, choices, and lifestyles that lead to a state of holistic health. Now, coming from a wellness institute, I was a little disappointed because that really doesn't say much, does it? So another definition that I found was a way of life oriented toward optimal health and well-being in which body, mind, and spirit are integrated by the individual to live life more fully within the human and natural community. Well, that's getting closer to an idea. At least it draws in the idea of body, mind, and spirit are all working together and that we want to live as fully as possible. And then the World Health Organization says that wellness is a state of complete physical, mental, and social well-being, and not merely just the absence of disease or infirmity. And I like that. I like the way that they stated that. Just to give you a little idea about wellness, wellness is actually sort of its own science now. There are many wellness models, and most models are based on elements. And those elements, the ones that are used the most are these. They look at the individual's emotional, environmental, financial, intellectual, occupational, physical, social, spiritual, cultural, coping, and creative lives. They look at all of those elements, but it depends on the organization or the agency that is doing the wellness support as to which of these they're actually going to use in their model. Many models kind of focus on a basic 8, and those 8 tend to be physical, emotional, social, intellectual, environmental, spiritual, vocational, and financial. These are the ones that most global approaches kind of look at these 8 elements. Mental health folks pare it down even more. And the models that most mental health agencies, let's say, look at, or the model that is used in research the most on wellness, looks at the creative self, the physical self, the social self, the essential self, and that's another way of saying the spiritual self, and the coping self. And so this is what we're going to look at today. And we're going to look at each of these in turn. But I just wanted to kind of set the groundwork so that you got an idea of what is it we're talking about when we're talking about wellness. And so we're going to look at these 5 elements and how to approach them in a way that we can live to our fullest in this environment that we are in that is causing us to have such extreme levels of anxiety. So as we move to talking about this, the next section, we're going to talk about survival mechanisms and what they are. But to start, just to get us moving in that direction, I'm going to turn it over to Aaron to do our first polling question.
Absolutely, Dwayne. The question is all survival mechanisms can be classified as fight, flight, freeze, or fawn?
Now,
and Dwayne, maybe you could tell us. Yeah, I was just going to say.
I'm sorry, I should have explained before. Most of us have heard of fight, flight, freeze. These are kind of the basic reactions we have to a traumatic situation or a high stress situation. We will either stand up and fight it. Usually that's motivated by anger. We will flight, we will run from it, usually motivated by fear, or freeze when we don't know what to do. But there is also a fourth one that you hear of every once in a while, and that's called fawn. And fawn is when we know that we cannot fight and we cannot run from the situation. We're not frozen, but we know that we don't have the ability in this moment to run from it or to fight it. And so we go along with it until we find the opportunity to fight, flight, or freeze, to get away from it or to stand up and fight for it. Often this is thought of as sort of the Stockholm syndrome, where it almost looks like I'm participating in the stress, or I'm an element of it until I can find that moment when I can either get out and run or I can stand up and fight. So that's what fawn is. So back to the question, and Aaron.
Perfect. And we'll give folks just about another 10 seconds or so to go ahead and respond. And we're getting a great response rate here. All right, everyone. In the interest of time, I'm going to go ahead and close down the poll. I'll share the results. Dwayne, 80% indicated that statement is true. 20%, of course, indicated false. So is it true or false?
It is true. When you look at any of the survival mechanisms, which we will define in just a minute, you will, as you think about them, they fall into one of those four classifications, one of those four areas. Either it's a form of fighting, and that doesn't necessarily mean I got my dukes up, but it could be that I'm standing up for myself, that I'm pushing back a little bit when somebody's trying to bully me, that sort of thing. Flight doesn't necessarily mean I physically run, but it can mean that I just walk away, and that sort of thing. And so in some form, all four of these survival mechanisms will fall under one of these four. So what is a survival mechanism? Well, again, I looked at some definitions, and in the first one I thought, well, let me look in the dictionary. Let's just see what the dictionary says. And it says, a way of protecting oneself from being hurt by other people. Well, I thought that was pretty lousy. So, because it's not just people that we have to protect ourselves from. And so went on and found another one which said, something you or your body does automatically in order to survive in a dangerous or unpleasant situation. And I like that one because this kind of breaks it down to say, okay, you may consciously do this, or your body may instinctively do this when it is in danger. And that's true. Many times when we respond in a survival mechanism, it's not conscious. It is something that we do instinctively to stay alive. That whole fight, flight, freeze idea. Techniques employed to endure through adverse situations, that certainly makes sense. And engagement in activities and practices that assist in maintaining one's well-being while in an adverse environment. And actually, this is the definition of wellness that we're going to use as we're looking at wellness in this context. So that's to give you kind of an idea. Now, let's look at the idea of survival mode too, because I think this also kind of plays into what a lot of people are feeling at this point of, like they said, moving from crisis to crisis, or just always feeling on edge, and never really feeling safe or feeling relaxed, just always on edge. So Dr. Marson here says that survival mode is the following. It's stressful stimuli cause a physiological and psychological response called our survival mode. This mode involves the release of stress hormones, remember that, and the activation of our stress response system. Our mind and body become focused on combating danger. And we're going to really break this down in just a minute, but this is exactly it. We release stress hormones, our body and brain go into this stress response system, and we are on alert for danger. Survival mode originally evolved to help us handle threats. When we cannot escape or flight, which are states of physiological hyperarousal, we are wired to freeze. So there's your fight, flight, freeze. a state of hypoarousal. Both hypoarousal and hyperarousal responses are highly effective for brief stressors. However, if the stress is constant, prolonged survival mode becomes maladaptive. And that's kind of what we're looking at here. The idea that if we're really running on a survival mode, if we're running on fight, flight, freeze here, high anxiety because of our environment, and we do that for a long period of time, what does that do to our body? What does that do to our brain? And how does that affect us in a negative way? And why is it important then to take steps to counter this, which is what I'm trying to encourage you to do here. And the steps that we're going to take are the wellness model. So let's look at how this works. So as you can see from this little diagram here, the only way that your brain gets information is through your five senses. All right, and so as that information goes into your brain, it hits the thalamus first, and the thalamus does this thing of splitting information equally between the cortex and the amygdala. Cortex is your gray matter. That's where stuff is kind of filed away. I like to think of the cortex as like a little library. And you got a little librarian in there that kind of putzes around and puts things where it belongs in the cortex. And that doesn't happen very quickly. It's a process. But the thalamus sends half the information then to the amygdala. And the amygdala, you got two of those, one on each side of the brain. The amygdala is actually your fear center and your anger center. It is the center that starts the fight, flight, freeze response in the brain and the body. So the amygdala scans all information that comes in 24/7. It's constantly scanning information and then kind of searching the cortex to see if, with this new information that's coming in, is there any memory in the cortex that would tell us that this new stuff is dangerous, that we are at risk when this new information comes in. And so it's constantly scanning, looking for danger, looking for danger, looking for danger. That's what the amygdala does. And it's the way that it tends to respond is through fear or anger. Fear being the motivator for fight. Fear being the motivator for flee, and anger being the motivator for fight. And those being instinctual responses, quite honestly. But the amygdala also, when it does do this, when it does see danger, it actually causes, it starts this whole process that actually ends up stimulating the adrenal glands, which will then release cortisol. Cortisol is the stress hormone. Now, remember Dr. Marsden's definition. She said that survival mode, one of the things that it does is it releases stress hormones. Well, that's cortisol. And so the amygdala causes cortisol to be released. The more the amygdala believes you are in danger, the more the cortisol gets released. And so that becomes the very first step in this response that we have, whether you want to call it a stress response or a trauma response, if the situation is traumatic. And so all of this is based on the information that's coming in from your five senses. And so I want to ask you, what are your five senses telling your brain on a daily basis? I want you to think about this. What information is getting into your brain on a pretty continual basis as you go through your day every day? Well, I'm going to help you with that. I want you to think about this. So we're exposed to news, we're exposed to social media, we're exposed to people talking on the street, we're exposed to, you can't go into a waiting room anymore that doesn't have a TV on that usually has some kind of news on it. And so what's being fed into our brain? So I did a little kind of survey, my own little survey of the news here. I live in the Washington, D.C. area, of the news here for the last week. And what was the number one story? What was the number two story? What was the number three story most often during that week? Number one, shootings. And stories about shootings. Every night, stories about shootings. Now, we've had stories about shootings before. I mean, this is nothing new. I remember hearing about shootings, pretty much my whole life. Why are these suddenly taking our notice? Why is it suddenly different to hear about these shootings? Well, first of all, there's so many of them. And one of the other things is they're involving such young people for the most part. But here's the other thing. It used to be when you heard about a shooting, you'd say, well, I don't live in that part of town, so I don't really have to worry about that. What part of town now? I mean, shootings now are happening in malls. They're happening with a father and a daughter who are chasing a ball into a neighbor's yard, somebody knocking on a door by mistake, somebody trying to get in a car by mistake, schools, downtown areas, subways. These shootings are happening in places that we find ourselves in. This is no longer, we can no longer say, well, I'm safe because I'm not in that area anymore. So it's starting to come home. The number 2 story was carjackings. And again, carjackings, we often think, well, I'm very careful about where I park, and I'm very careful about, where I go with my car. And so I don't really have to worry about that. No, not anymore. I mean, people walk out their front door at home to get in their car, and there are people waiting for them to jack their car. So that was number 2. And often there are situations where there's a pet or a baby in the car. And so again, these are situations where we can't really separate from them anymore. They're happening around us. And we're starting to realize that, hey, this could happen to me. And the number 3 story, and this one's probably the scariest if you have kids, is fentanyl overdoses in schools. And again, we used to say, well, I made sure that I moved to the area that had this best school around, and This is happening in every school. This kind of situation now is it's to the point where schools are actually teaching kids how to use Narcan on their friends if they have an overdose. So the difference today is that we can no longer separate from these things. These things have been around forever, but we can't separate from them anymore because they're now happening, around the corner, at the school across the street. All of these things are now coming home to play. And then let's look at disasters, natural disasters. I mean, places that never used to be flooded are getting flooded. Look at the number of tornadoes that we've had over the past few years. Look at the volatile storms that have come through in the winter and in the summer. And these are, if you do any research, you find that these are larger storms and more frequent in number than before. These are increasing, and again, they're coming home. They're coming to where we are. All right, take a breath. My point here was not to scare you, but how do you feel after I've kind of thrown all those things at you? Did this make you feel a little bit on edge? Did this make you feel kind of like, I don't want to hear this, just chill, did it make you feel uncomfortable? That's your body and your brain reacting to information. So if you had a reaction to me going through this stuff, imagine what your body and brain are going through all the time with information coming in from the television, from social media, from whatever. So my point here, and I did that purposefully, just to kind of make you a little on edge and make you feel a little uncomfortable so that you could see just hearing somebody talk about it can cause us to have a reaction. Your amygdala took what I was saying, said, warning, 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 these things could happen to you, and started a small reaction, started to release a small amount of cortisol. Now, because it was just something you were hearing about, you're not flooding with it, but you are releasing a small amount, and that's why you're starting to feel uncomfortable. It's actually causing your heart rate to increase and your respiration to increase. So when I say that we are in survival mode, when I say that we really have to think in terms of survival mechanisms, this shows you how we react when we are exposed to this kind of information. Now, I also want you to think about, let me go back. Another thing I want you to think about is, let's look at your job. All right, most of you, whether you're victims advocates or you're working in probation, or you're a corrections officer, or you're a court official, you're exposed to other people's trauma in your job constantly. And so not only are you exposed to these things that could be affecting you and your family directly, but in your job, you are exposed to trauma on an ongoing basis, secondary trauma on an ongoing basis. And every time you're exposed to somebody else's trauma, your body does that same thing. You start to release cortisol, your body starts to have a reaction to it, particularly if it's a situation that you're have personal experience in, or it's a person that you are working with that you have some concern about or some care about. But honestly, just being exposed to the adversive details of trauma repeatedly can actually qualify you as being exposed to trauma. If you look at the diagnosis for PTSD, one of the things that you have to meet is the criteria for how were you exposed to it. And one way is that I may actually have that on a slide. And let's wait and see. I think it's after this one. But I want you to recognize that just being exposed to other people's stories of trauma also causes a traumatic reaction in you. So put all of this together, yeah, it's kind of a wonder that we're actually putting one foot in front of the other, isn't it, when you think about it? We are really well designed to be able to withstand trauma and stress, but for how long? And so if we don't start taking care of ourselves, we may start to see some negative effects of this trauma. But just to remind you about secondary trauma, so all of the things that I've told you about now are secondary trauma. All of those things that I told you about as far as shootings and fentanyl and all of that, you were hearing it. You weren't directly experiencing it. You hear it on the news, you see it on social media, but you're not directly experiencing it. So that's secondary trauma. And of course, at your job, you didn't actually see the trauma happen to your client, unless you may have. But for the most part, we hear them tell us the story about the trauma or about the incident or about the crime. If you work in corrections, you may actually see some of that happening. But most of the time, we're not exposed directly to it. We are getting the secondary trauma response to it. So here is that criteria I was telling you about for post-traumatic stress disorder. Look at the very bottom one: experiencing repeated or extreme exposure to adversive details of the traumatic event. So this comes out of the Diagnostic Statistical Manual of Mental Health Disorders by the American Psychiatric Association. That is a book that we mental health folks make our diagnoses from. It gives us criteria that have to be met for someone to have a certain diagnosis. And in this book, it gave the example for this experiencing repeated or extreme exposure. It gave the example of law enforcement personnel who are constantly hearing story of child sexual abuse. And it also gave another example of people who clean up crime scenes. They don't actually see the event, but they're exposed to the adversive detail of the events. So if you go on and read the rest of this, it says does not apply to exposure through electronic media. So all of that stuff that I was talking to you about, that we hear on the news and that we see on social media, all of that doesn't count. It doesn't count because the reason they put that qualifier in there is because this actually came out after 9/11, and what a lot of situations were showing us was there were people who were actually trying to get a diagnosis of PTSD after 9/11, having been exposed to it on TV. And they were trying to get the diagnosis so that they could claim disability, that sort of thing. And so basically what mental health folks said was, well, you can always turn your TV off. If you were uncomfortable watching it on TV and you didn't turn it off, that's not PTSD, that's another mental health disorder. So they disqualify electronic media unless it's work related. So all those things that I was talking to you about that we hear on the news, et cetera, we could turn those off, absolutely. It's hard. Like I said, you can't walk into a waiting room or whatever without news being on, but ultimately we could turn it off. So that doesn't count toward trauma, toward PTSD, but it still causes a traumatic reaction in your body. It still causes the reaction of the heart rate to increase, the respiration to increase, and some other things that we're going to look at in just a couple of minutes. So now your work, absolutely. Anything that's work related that you're exposed to secondary trauma absolutely counts as being exposed to trauma that could, if you met all the other criteria for PTSD, lead to that diagnosis. So what do I mean when I say, even though it may not qualify you for a diagnosis of PTSD because it was electronic media, it's still causing the traumatic response or the stress response? Well, what I mean by that is that the amygdala is causing cortisol to be released into the system. We talked about that. And cortisol has a certain effect on the body and the brain. The more your amygdala believes you are in danger, the more cortisol is released into your system, and the more you will see these symptoms. Cortisol causes these symptoms. It causes the interference with the ability to concentrate, or the interference with memory. And you probably can recognize that when you're really stressed, you got to write down things. You got to put them on a list. It's hard to stay focused on one thing. You get, shiny. You get distracted by things. It impedes the ability to learn. The difference between memory and learning is memory is stored away not for a particular purpose. It's stored away as a chronicle of experience. Learning is filed away purposefully so that it can be pulled up again for a specific time and specific purpose. Repetitive thinking, getting into thinking loops. Anger. Have you noticed over the last couple of years that you get angry more often? Do you notice that you get more intensely angry than you used to get? Are you finding that your anger is out of proportion to the stimulus, that you kind of get overly angry over the last couple of years when things set you off? Have you noticed that you sort of have a negative worldview now, that you sort of kind of view the world as a negative place as opposed to a positive place? And do you, hypervigilance, do you expect negative things to happen? Is that the way you think and perceive of the world right now? Do you have trouble sleeping? Are you noticing that your immune system tends to not be functioning as well as it used to? Are you catching more colds? Do they last longer? Does it take longer for wounds and bruises to heal? Do you find that you feel more pain than you normally do, or that you did a couple of years ago? Dissociation is where you feel like you don't fit in. Are there times that you just don't feel like you fit in like you used to? You know, even with a group of friends, perhaps, or a neighborhood, or a civic group, or a church, or whatever, that you used to really feel connected, and now you don't feel like you fit so much anymore. Have you noticed that you don't allow yourself to care about things as much anymore? What I mean by that is, you may have been the kind of person that really would get caught up when you would hear stories about, animals being abused, and you'd really get caught up about that and really care about that, and maybe really donated money and that sort of thing. And now you don't allow yourself to connect emotionally to things like you used to. And depression associated with trauma is not, or stress is not sadness. It's more a matter of motivation. Have you found that there are times when you really want to do something, and for whatever reason, you just can't get it together to do it? It's not that you're too tired. It's not that you just kind of, it comes time to do it, and you just kind of say, oh, I'll do it next time. You just kind of can't get the motivation to do it anymore. These are symptoms of high levels of cholesterol. I'm sorry, cholesterol, listen to me. High levels of cortisol in your system as a response to stress, as a response to trauma. And the more your amygdala believes you're in danger, the stronger these symptoms will be. So if you see 2 or 3 of these that, yeah, they kind of come and go, all right, you're a human being. Welcome to the world. You're a human being. We all have some of these sometimes. But if you notice that there's like 3 or more of these that are happening pretty regularly, and that, yeah, the anger is building. I do notice that. And yeah, I have been detaching over the last few years. If you notice 3 or more of these that are pretty consistent, then you're having this response. You're having the stress response. You have higher cortisol levels. And so we're going to talk about what to do about that, but recognize it. Be honest with yourself and look at these things and say, do these things actually happen to me? And are they worse than they were a couple of years ago? And that's a good way for you to determine if you are having a survival mode kind of response to the things that are happening around you. So the way to deal with those is, remember we talked about they are based on cortisol. One of the things that actually reduces cortisol is the release of endorphin. And endorphin can be released in a number of ways. But the number one basic way to release endorphin, quickest way, is exercise. And this doesn't necessarily mean you got to go to the gym and work out and pump iron and all that sort of thing. It means basically 20 minutes, 3 times a week, break a sweat. So that can be walking, that can be taking a run, that can be riding a bike, can be walking up and down the stairs, walking back and forth to your mailbox. It just some kind of activity that is consistent, and a minimum of 3 times a week, 20 minutes, break a sweat. All right, that will release endorphin. Endorphin will bring down the cortisol levels. Any of you who work out, I mean, really do work out, when you're really, really stressed and then you go work out, how do you feel afterwards? You feel terrific. This is immediate. This actually is an immediate way to deal with that higher cortisol levels. It comes down immediately. The problem is that you have to do this on a consistent basis because you're constantly being stimulated. Negative information is coming into your brain, into your amygdala constantly. So every day, every 2 or 3 days, you need to release some endorphin to bring down cortisol to keep the levels low. Laughter also releases endorphin and causes a reduction of cortisol. Just feeling nurtured, feeling that somebody cares about you. So putting yourself in a situation around somebody who cares about you will help to release endorphin and bring down cortisol level. And then feeling good about yourself, setting small goals and achieving them and giving yourself a pat on the back when you achieve them will help to release release endorphin, bring down cortisol levels. So these are ways that you can just take control of that level of cortisol right now. You can start it right away. Really start to reduce the, sorry, I'm going the wrong way, reduce the effect of these symptoms that we just talked about, all right? So let's look a little more specifically at what else happens. So that's how cortisol will affect the brain, that list of symptoms. But something else happens when your amygdala decides that you are in danger. When the amygdala decides that you are in danger, doesn't matter how much, any amount of danger, it starts the fight, flight, freeze response. That's the first step, is to release cortisol. But the second step, actually, cortisol is the second step. The first step is it starts your heart rate to increase and your respiration to increase. Why? Because the amygdala knows that if you're going to go into fight or flight, even freeze, you're going to need more oxygen in your system, more oxygen in your cells, in your body than normal. And so as soon as it sees that you may be in a situation of danger, it immediately increases heart rate and immediately increases respiration. All right, that's happening most of the time. This is why so many people have high blood pressure. This is why heart rates are high. And when we are experiencing anxiety, these are physical symptoms of anxiety, is an increased heart rate and respiration. Now, an interesting thing about the body and the brain and how they talk to each other, remember we said all the information that goes to the brain comes from the five senses, which are in the body, all right? So the conversation between the body and brain, 90% of that conversation comes from the body and goes to the brain. Only about 10% of the conversation is from the brain to the body. So when the amygdala says, okay, fight, flight, freeze, we're going to increase heart rate, that's information coming from the brain to the body. But you know what? We can actually tell the amygdala, slow it down. We're going to stop this. And we can do that simply by slowing down our breath, all right? And focusing on our breathing. Very simply, inhale on the count of 3, exhale on the count of 3. Do that a couple of times and then inhale on the count of 4, exhale on the count of 4. Do that a few times and increase it to 5. When you do that, you are slowing down your respiration, you are slowing down your heart rate, and you are telling the amygdala, no, we are not going into a stress reaction. We are not going into a fight, flight, freeze response, all right? And you actually slow down the amygdala's actions by doing that. Very simple, and it's one of the basics to getting control of your body back and keeping it out of that survival mode, because this is the first step into survival mode, is increasing heart rate and increasing respiration. So you can control that. Another thing to consider is that when we are highly stressed, when we go into this sort of fight, flight, freeze response or the survival mode response, we tend, we've got two hemispheres of the brain, left hemisphere, right hemisphere, and they're actually connected by, if you can see my arrow, by this thing that looks like a fish hook sitting on its nose. This is called the corpus callosum. It's right in the middle of the brain, and it kind of looks like a fish hook sitting up on its nose. That's the connective tissue between the right brain and the left brain. When we get highly, highly stressed or having a traumatic response, even a secondary traumatic response, we tend to freeze in right brain. Right brain is where the imagination is. Right brain is sort of the artsy, creative side of the brain. So people say, well, if we're going to freeze, we might, that's a good place to freeze, as opposed to the left side, which is linear thinking, strategic thinking, mathematics, that sort of thing. Well, the problem is when we are frozen in right brain, when we kind of stick into the right side of the brain, what do you think our imagination is focusing on? It's focusing on whatever the stressor is that has us stuck in right brain. So whatever that was that caused you, so you start to get caught up in those images and in those in that thinking, and even going down those rabbit holes about what if, we get stuck in that in the right side of the brain. Interesting thing about the brain, again, is we can help that brain get unstuck with our body. Anything that you do that is bilateral will cause the brain to function across the corpus callosum. So I am sitting with my arms crossed and my hands are on my arms, my upper arms, all right? And I'm smacking them alternately. My left hand is hitting my right arm and my right hand is hitting my left arm. This is called the butterfly. And what this is doing is when I hit my left arm, it stimulates the right side of my brain. When I hit my right arm, it stimulates the left-hand side of my brain. So by doing this, I'm literally causing my brain to kind of get stimulated on both sides. So anything you do with your body that is bilateral, that would be walking, running, swimming, biking, cycling, spinning, doing the elliptical, doing the treadmill. Anything that uses the two sides of the body helps get us out of that stuck place in the right brain and gets us thinking more clearly again, gets us thinking and processing much more fully, rather than being stuck in right brain and going down those rabbit holes and staying there. So anything that you can do to use the two sides of your body, even stress balls, in your one in each hand, and alternate them, that kind of thing will cause the brain to function better across the corpus callosum. So there's another way that you can kind of pull yourself out of a stress response. Other things that happen is that um, I'm just looking at the clock and realizing, oh my God, I got to get moving. We have a response in what we call the social response area. So when we are stressed, our voice actually goes up a couple of notes. Our field of vision, we stop using our peripheral vision, and we tend to be very zoned in our field of vision. We set our muscles in our jaw and tighten the muscles in our face and around that area. And so again, if we want to tell our brain, no, we're not doing this, we need to relax all that. And the best way to relax all that is to have a conversation with a friend. You know, our voice will come back to normal. Our eyes will move as we start to talk and interact with them. The muscles in our jaw starts to relax. So there's another way that we can tell the brain to shut down the stress response. We already talked about the hearts and lungs, and then the subdiaphragm. The subdiaphragm area is the area where there's excretion, reproduction, and digestion. You know that when you get highly stressed, you probably have some problems with digestion. And one of the things that happens when we are stressed for a long period of time, what will happen is when we first get stressed, our digestive system and our excretion system actually shut down. It's a reaction to fight, flight, freeze. So the brain tells the body, okay, we're in fight, flight, freeze. So digestion and excretion shuts down because it doesn't want to, you don't want to be running away from a predator and have to stop and say, oh, wait a minute, excuse me, I just have to go to the bathroom for a minute. You can't do that. And so it shuts down so that until you get out of the situation of fight, flight, or freeze. But if we are in a long period of time where we're in this heightened state, then what happens is digestion and excretion and reproduction turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off, turn on, turn off. And you could see things like perhaps moving back and forth between constipation, diarrhea, being able to digest, not digest, digest, not digest. It goes back and forth. And the interesting thing is, when this is turning on, turning off, turning on, turning off, we are also vacillating between depression, anxiety, depression, anxiety. The chemistry makeup of this area of the body, when it turns on, turns off, turns on, turns off, causes us to fall into that pattern of alternating between anxiety, depression, like it says here on this slide. So, like I said, we're going to use sort of the definition of wellness as being an engagement in activities and practices that assist in maintaining one's well-being while in an adverse environment. And just understand that, we've come through a process to get to wellness. Way back when, 20, 25 years ago, everybody was focused on stress management, and those techniques worked really well when you were already stressed. So then we decided, well, maybe we should try to do something so we don't get stressed. So we moved into this idea of self-care. And self-care was pretty much about the body. It looked at nutrition, relaxation, rest or sleep, and exercise. And everything got focused on the body. And it worked pretty well. But then what we realized, and it helped us be prepared for stress, except that what we started to realize was a lot of the stress that we experience doesn't come from the outside. It comes from our own brain, from our own expectations of ourselves, our own self-judgment, our own self-expectations. And so we moved into resiliency to help us to not only prepare the body for stress, but also look at how we are looking at ourselves and what we're telling ourselves and what we're forcing ourselves to do. And the problem with that was we made it a separate part of our life. We took time to be resilient. We took time to look at the expectations and whatever. And so now we're in this idea of wellness where we're making it part of our life. All of these things working together so that we can live to our fullest, as we have said. And so we're going to look at creative, physical, social, essential, and coping self. But before we do that, I'm going to turn this over to Aaron for a polling question.
Perfect. And I'm opening that question right now. The question is to nurture the creative self, one should, and if you could select one of those four options, either explore their natural artistic talents, be more aware of the beauty in their surroundings, develop their own problem-solving skills, and that last option is both A and B, the top two options. So they explore natural artistic talents and be more aware. And Dwayne, we'll give folks just about another 5 seconds. I'm sorry to close out the poll so quickly, but I want to make sure you have plenty of time on your side.
Okay.
All right, sharing the results. 86%, a definite majority, indicated that it's the top two options, exploring their natural artistic talents and being more aware of beauty. Is this the right answer?
No. No. C is the right answer. Develop problem-solving skills. See, creativity, the definition of creativity is problem solving outside of the box. So artists, art and beauty fall under creativity. Creativity does not fall under art and beauty. So artistic talents, yes. Beauty, all that, yes, that's part of creativity. But what does an artist do? An artist says, okay, how do I get that tree onto this canvas? And they do a problem-solving process of figuring out how they're using their talents on how they're going to get that tree on the piece of canvas that they're painting on. Or how do I get that person's body into this piece of clay as I'm sculpting their body? It's problem solving. And so it stimulates a part of the brain that is reserved particularly for problem solving. And so it is important that we, to keep our creativity alive, it is important that we do some problem solving throughout, occasionally, just to keep that part of the brain active. And so what I would suggest to you is, it's interesting, things like Sudoku, which uses numbers to solve problems, crossword puzzles, which use words to solve problems, jigsaw puzzles, which uses space and color to solve problems. Any of the three of those actually stimulates the part of the brain that is the creative part of the brain. And what I'm suggesting here is if we do some kind of a puzzle like that a couple of times a week for 10, 15 minutes, and just keep that part of the brain active, when we are confronted with a problem that needs to be solved, that part of the brain is already flexed. It's already been practiced. It's already used to being used. If we don't keep that part of the brain sort of exercised, and then a problem comes, it's harder for us to get into problem solving mode and to be able to draw on those out of the box ideas to solve that problem. And so just a couple of times a week, just do a puzzle for 10, 15 minutes, just to keep that part of the brain active. When we talk about the physical self, exercise, like I talked about before, making sure that you get enough sleep for you. Relaxation is how do you spend your time not working and not being responsible. It's sort of like, how do you relax? What do you do as a hobby? What is your relaxation? And then making sure that you eat healthy. And I'm not advocating that you have to, give up carbs and give up sweets and all that sort of thing, but eat everything in moderation. Follow your body. Your body will tell you what it likes and what it doesn't like, and eat in proportions that are appropriate. And when you are stressed, then yes, reduce the sugar, reduce the caffeine, reduce the carbs, because those are going to be harder to digest when you're stressed. And then when you come out of a period of stress and you're no longer stressed, then pick them back up again. But just listen to your body and eat in a healthy way. And now we have another polling question. I'm really moving along.
And if you, perfect. Yeah, I was going to say, if you wanted to skip any of these, Dwayne, you certainly can. Question
Okay. Okay, let's go ahead and just skip this one. I'll just do it. Social interaction actually benefits us with all of the above. It helps us to reassure our self-worth, because if somebody actually stops and talks to us, that means that they value us enough that they want to spend their time talking to us. And so that helps us to reassure our self-worth. It helps us to organize our thoughts. There was a study done just a couple of years ago where they were trying to see if social interaction actually caused the amygdala to stop sending out warnings. And so that if we were with other people, the amygdala wouldn't say that we were in danger. And of course, the research failed. The amygdala was not affected by social interaction one way or the other. But what they did find was a whole different part of the brain got activated when there was social interaction, and we released oxytocin, which is the hormone for bonding. It found that it allowed us to organize our thoughts better. It was in an area of the brain that helps us to put thoughts in order. So when you're really, really stressed, or really in a stressful situation, you know your thoughts just kind of come all the time. Remember, I said you can't concentrate, all that sort of thing. But by social interaction and the release of oxytocin, it actually helps us to put those thoughts in order. And it also helps to provide with problem-solving skills. Just talking to somebody and saying, hey, I got this problem, I don't know what to do, and maybe getting some suggestions from someone else. And so these are, again, the things we were just talking about as far as social interaction. And I think the other thing is empathy. We naturally empathize with others, and others empathize with us. It again helps us to feel that our emotions are important, as well as that we are valued. Yeah, I think that pretty well covers those. The essential self is the spiritual self. And so you want to look at what are the things in your life that make you feel fulfilled? What kind of activity makes you feel fulfilled? Volunteering, camping out in nature, going to church? What kind of situation, what is it that makes you feel fulfilled? That when you walk away from it, you say, I am so glad I had that experience, that I did that. And then how often do you do that? And really planning and thinking about how to plan that for yourself. Other things for essential self include hope, having a sense of hope. People who have no hope cannot think about the future. The only way we can think about the future is to believe that there is one, and that is a sense of hope. And so having a sense of hope and being able to plan for the future is another way of developing that sense of essential self. Knowing your value, and that's a little harder, but the idea of having hope, an optimistic state of mind that is based on expectation with confidence of positive outcomes with respect to events and circumstances in one's life or the world at large. Believing that things could be better. And that's really it. And so ways of building your sense of hope is through humor, just looking at how did I get through things before, and if I got through those, I can get through this. The more you believe you are in control, the more hope you have. But the real way to do it is to establish goals or to establish a plan. And the answer to this one is even when somebody is afraid of the future, the fact that they have a sense of future means that they have a small amount of hope. Even if they are afraid, there is a small amount of hope where they could not have a sense of future. So the idea of, I am grateful for the possibility that this will work out well. I like this statement because even if you do not believe things are going to work out well, you can always be grateful for the possibility that they could. Yeah, I know there's a possibility it could. I don't believe it's gonna, but I know that it could. That's a statement of hope. And being able to have that statement and then build on it can help us kind of get through things. Sense of future is really important, and having the ability to, let's do it this way. Let's say you have plans for this Saturday, all right? But this week is going to be the toughest week of the year for you. Well, guess what? During the week, as you're going through this tough week, and you go, boy, I can't wait until Saturday. I can't wait until Saturday. You see, it helps us get through the challenges to work toward that expectation. And so the idea of setting goals, setting a plan, it gives us a sense of future, but it also builds our sense of hope, and it allows us to have something to look forward to and to move forward to. So that's another essential part of the essential self. Making a goal, a simple goal, one that you know you can achieve, and doing it and achieving it is a way of establishing a sense of hope and a sense of future. And it doesn't matter if how much of it you accomplish. Even, if you say, okay, I'm going to do the dishes, and then you realize that you only have enough time to do the silverware, well, that's fine. You did something. By doing something, it helps move you to a place where you can say, yeah, I did that, and I'll be able to do more. It helps to build hope, and it helps to give us a sense of future and make a plan that we can fulfill. Coping is basically the use of cognitive and behavioral strategies to manage the demands of a situation when these are appraised as taxing or exceeding one's resources. When you're in a situation where you don't think you can handle the situation, then you use cognitive or behavioral strategies to reduce the negative emotions and conflict that's caused by the stress. And so what I ask you to do here is just look at the coping mechanisms that you use. Most of us developed our coping mechanisms as adolescents, and we haven't gone back and reevaluated if they're still working for us. Are they still doing for us what they were supposed to do? Or should we be looking at some newer coping strategies that may be helping us a little better? Remember that how we perceive things in the past affects the way that we think today, and it also affects the way we plan for the future. So recognizing that all of that has a play in how we prepare ourselves and live our lives in the face of all of the stressors that we are facing today. Move on past that. There are some simple, if you're in the moment and you're feeling extremely stressed, some simple things to do. One, focus on your body, focus on your breathing, like we talked about before. Increase the length of time of inhale and exhale. Focus on your environment. A quick way of doing that would be to say, I'm going to name 3 things in this room that I see. I'm going to name 2 things that I hear. I'm going to name 1 thing that I smell. I'm going to feel how the chair feels underneath me. What you're doing is you're taking your attention off of the stressor for a few minutes. You're focusing entirely on your environment or your body, and it's helping your body to reset and your amygdala to stop the fight, flight, freeze response for a few moments. You can also play patty cake or hokey pokey. And what's good about these is like hokey pokey, there's a little jingle you have to do, and there's a little, a little dance that you do with it and that sort of thing. It totally disconnects you from the stressor. It kind of makes you laugh, and laughter releases endorphin, which brings down cortisol level, and it kind of resets you. So those are little things that you can do to just get back on track. The handout that I have provided kind of allows you to go through all of these things and keep track of how often are you doing them, and maybe set some goals for yourself to include them into your life so that you are not in survival mode all the time, so that you can recognize that you have some control over that and that you're not living from crisis to crisis to crisis. All right, I'm 3 minutes over, Aaron. I'm sorry.
You did really, really well, Dwayne. And by the way, I really love that quote that you had there last, the Lao Tzu. Okay, folks, if you have questions for Dwayne, now's the time to get them into the GoToWebinar toolbar. We've already received a number, and we'll try to get to as many as we can. Wanted to also let you know Dwayne is back with us in March 2024 for working with survivors' need for control. But I also wanted to let you know that on June 1st of this year, Wendy Hummel is back with us to discuss tools to manage the stress response. So if you want to join us for either one of those, go to the Justice Clearinghouse website, select webinar schedule from our calendar, from our menu bar. And again, we've got 2 webinars, one with Dwayne, March 2024, Working with Survivors' Need for Control, and June 1 with Wendy Hummel. All right, Dwayne, if you're ready, can I go ahead and start working through these questions?
Absolutely.
Perfect. So first question is this: how do we reframe past experiences to change our perception?
Excellent question. And it's a matter of not so much reframing it as giving it a different meaning and value. So, um, uh, um, and I love these questions because unfortunately you can't do them quickly, but it's a matter of so you have a past experience that has caused you to, let's say it's, I'll just make one up. Let's say you were walking through an alley and you were assaulted, all right? And so now every time you see an alley, you have a fear response, you have a fight, flight, freeze response. It's a trigger. So the way to look at that, and this is going to sound very simplistic, and I don't mean it that way, but the way to do that is to give the alley a different meaning. In other words, every time you look at an alley, you think that's where a person gets assaulted. Well, what else happens in an alley? Well, sometimes kids play in an alley. And, you know, if you look down some alleys, they've got windows and apartments, people looking over it. And maybe there are 2 old women talking back and forth across the alley from their apartment windows. And there's an old cook sitting out smoking a cigarette. By giving it a different meaning, so that when you think of alley, you don't think of assault, but you start to think of these other things too. I'm not saying you forget the assault, but it's one of many things that happen in an alley. You start to change the meaning and value that you're giving the word alley. So I know that sounds very simplistic, but look at whatever that situation is and look at what else happens in that kind of context. You're seeing it from one viewpoint, but are there other viewpoints to see that context so that it has a different meaning and value that isn't just about the trauma or the stressor that you're experiencing? I'll leave it at that, Aaron.
Fantastic. Okay, we've got another great question here from Jared. I see people smoking because they're stressed. Does it actually reduce stress or does it create more?
Actually, nicotine is a stimulus, and so it actually, for the body, it might stimulate it even more. But here's what it is: it's an oral response. One of the basics as children, you know, when we were an infant and we needed something, we cried. And so if we got usually we cried because we were hungry. So what happened? We got a bottle, or mom fed us. And so the oral sensation became, for us as infants, the satisfaction became, oral gratification became the satisfaction of the situation. And so that's what happens with cigarettes, is it becomes sort of that placebo. It becomes the way of getting that oral gratification. You know, food becoming the idea of comfort food. We eat when we are upset. People will do things orally when they're upset. So that's where smoking actually comes in, is that sensation of getting the oral gratification. The other thing is, by not taking oxygen into your lungs, but taking something else into your lungs, it can give a little bit of a high. And I don't know the dynamics of that, so I won't go any further with that. But I know when I used to smoke, that first cigarette in the morning, I'd get a little rush out of it, and I kind of looked forward to that. So I think there's that element as well. But no, technically, it causes more stress in the body. But that oral fixation, that's what we're looking for. We sort of feel, psychologically, we feel calmer with that oral fixation.
Got it. So I'm going to ask a follow-up on that one. So are there ways to start moving away from that oral fixation, or at least as a response?
Well, I think, yeah, there are. other ways of teaching ourselves of feeling gratified, so that it doesn't have to be physical, or it can be a different form of physical. It could be exercise. It could be taking deep breaths, just deep breaths of air instead of a cigarette. So I think there are other ways of teaching ourselves to feel gratification. That's one of those coping mechanisms that you may have learned as an adolescent, and you haven't really questioned yourself as to, is it still doing what it used to do for me? So yeah, I think we can teach ourselves other ways to gratify ourselves. But that's a very basic one. We learned that as an infant.
Right. Okay, next question is from Marnie. Are there any foods that can help a person de-stress or reduce cortisol?
Foods to reduce cortisol. I don't know of any. That doesn't mean there aren't, but I've never come across it in my research. I don't know. That's a very good question. I don't know of any, but again, that doesn't mean there aren't. Certainly there are foods that we know help us to calm down. Tea, for example, or for some people, warm milk, or even activities that are calming, like meditation or prayer or that sort of thing. But I have never heard of food that reduces cortisol, but I bet they're probably, oh, you know one that is? Chocolate. Chocolate actually does reduce cortisol.
Well,
It's
that's
not,
dangerous.
yeah, it is, isn't it? Isn't it? But there's an element in it. I do know that there is an element in chocolate that will help to reduce cortisol. Of course, then you become fat, but hopefully you're happy, so you can be fat and happy and have reduced cortisol.
Well, and we've got a couple of folks that have weighed in. Kuro, Charlotte, and Danielle have said avocados, broccoli, bananas, and dark chocolate can reduce
Ah,
cortisol.
okay, there you go. Okay, good. Thank you for
Awesome.
that. Thank you for adding that.
Absolutely. Okay, so next question is, what should I do if I'm seeing almost all of the stress response list in my own life?
Uh, well, I would first, well, hmm, if I were your therapist, um, I would immediately look at what are you doing to help reduce the cortisol in your body. Are you doing things like exercising? Are you socializing? Are you interacting with others? Are you making plans for the future and setting goals for yourself? Those kinds of things, all those things we talked about. I think I would, honestly, I think it might be time to go talk to a therapist, not because you need help. Yeah, you do, but not because there's a mental health issue, but to have somebody help you figure out what is it that's causing all of this at once? What is it that, what are the things that are promoting the stress response in you, and having somebody on the outside help you identify them and then come up with a plan on how to reduce them. Because there's some stressors in your life that are obviously causing this. And even if you can't eliminate the stressor, let's say, you're taking care of a parent, and you also have 3 kids, and you got all these stressors going on. You can't get rid of the stressors, but how can you cope with them better? And having somebody on the outside that can help you look at that. If you're really experiencing all of those, it's going to be hard for you to really take a step back and look at, what can I do about these? It may help to have somebody on the outside help guide you through that, and look at that. There are other people that can help with that. Certainly, religious folk, pastors, perhaps, a minister if you're religiously inclined. You might even look at a nutritionist, but all that kind of gets expensive, and so I recognize that. If you work someplace that you have an EAP, an employee assistance program, you might want to use that, because you get like 4 or 5 free sessions with a mental health person, and it shouldn't take too many to be able to kind of identify what are the stressors and what are a couple of coping skills I can use with them. You know, I say all the time, what is one thing that you can do to make this situation more livable? Just one little thing. And if you can do one little thing and one little thing and one little thing, that's a step. So that's kind of what I would suggest.
Dwayne, thank you so much for all the time that you spent with us today. Just to, and based on the audience reactions and based on the engagement, you did a fantastic webinar. We're pretty much out of time, but I wanted to give you at least a few seconds for any closing comments.
Thank you. This, we kind of came at it as this is survival mode and survival mechanisms and that sort of thing, but I really want you to be serious about this and really think about how much negativity comes in and how much that is affecting the way your body and your brain works, and you're not even consciously aware of it. That's the way it works. And heart rate goes up and blood pressure goes up and all these things happen and we're not really even conscious of it. So just take a moment and be conscious, be aware of all the stuff that's coming in and the simple things you can do. A little bit of exercise. I'll do a few puzzles during the week to keep that part of the brain working. Just look at that handout that I gave you and just kind of go through and pick 2 or 3 things that you want to do this week that will kind of help get you out of that living from crisis to crisis mode, that anxiety mode that you might be in. It's if you don't take care of yourself, who will? That's the bottom line. It's up to you to do this.
Great parting words. Thank you so much, Dwayne. For everyone that took the time to join us on this webinar, thank you so much. And with that, this concludes this morning's Justice Clearinghouse webinar. Take care, everyone, and please stay safe. Bye now.